Hi everybody in Psych 101. Today, or this video I should say, is Chapter 7, Thinking, Intelligence, and Language. Now honestly, these are three separate topics, but they're all rolled into one chapter because they all deal with cognition, our thinking, our problem solving, our beliefs, our attitudes, and honestly, none of these topics are really long enough to be in one chapter by themselves. It makes more sense to combine them. They're relatively short in nature. So let's get started. First, the cognitive revolution. This really happened twice. William James started this, as you hopefully know already, late early 1900s, but the cognitive revolution really started in the 1950s when we started to analyze thinking and problem solving. And there's no coincidence that that coincided with computers. Not the kind of computers we have today, but computers really started in the 1950s, and they tried to simulate computer processes with human thinking. So let's talk about various aspects of thinking and problem solving. First thing, elimination by aspects. You narrow down the decision you want to make by looking at all of the possibilities and then deciding which one will work best for you. So you're trying to pick a college class. There's thousands of them to choose from. You narrow it down based on your major, maybe whether you want in-person or online, maybe the instructor, maybe something that's interesting to you. Elimination by aspects until you narrow down your decision. Same thing when you're trying to decide what to have for lunch, stay home or go out, get takeout, how much to spend, you narrow it down. Next thing I'm going to keep simple. Heuristics versus algorithms. This gets complicated in the book. I'm going to make it simple and just what you need to know for the exam. Heuristic starts with H. So does this phrase. Helpful hint. That's what a heuristic is. Algorithm starts with A. Always. Follow the algorithm, you'll always get the right answer. So, how do you do well in college? Take notes, participate, ask for help when needed, study. Those are heuristics. They're not guarantees. Algorithms are formulas like math, chemistry, even when you're trying to cook something, if you follow the recipe, directions on how to get somewhere. Those, if followed, should always give you the right answer. Those of you who are athletes or play any sports, heuristics is what coaching is all about. How do we make you better? There's no guarantees. Same thing like making you a better student academically. Heuristics are helpful hints. Framing. Think politics and think sales. Framing is the way that something is described to you. Will have a lot to do with the decisions that you make and the choices that you decide upon. So, sales. If there was a new car and it was $29,000 and you're thinking, that's out of my price range. If they tell you, oh, this weekend it's only $27,000, that sounds a little better, but a sales technique is to tell you, we give you $2,000 in your pocket when you buy this car. It makes it seem like they're giving you something. It's a way of framing it, a way of describing it or explaining it. Politics. If we were to debate healthcare or anything else, immigration, anything else that's controversial, there are multiple ways of looking at it. By the way, in Chapter 1, we talked about critical thinking. Well, it comes up with framing. The way things are described to you will have a lot to do with the decisions that you will make. Framing. See, some of these concepts come up in multiple chapters. Functional fixedness is not a way to solve problems. It's a barrier to problem solving. So let me explain. I have this in front of me. We'll use it in a little bit here. If the fan was blowing and my papers were blowing all around, what if I thought to put this box on top of my papers. That would solve the problem. But I might not think of the box as a paperweight. I might need to be more creative to be able to do that. The same is true when it comes to getting a package in the mail from Amazon or UPS, and you might think, oh, I don't have a knife or scissors with me. Well, maybe you could use your keys to open it. You get over the functional fixedness. Now, the classic study that was done on this was from 1908. The researchers did something really clever and really simple. What they did was had an empty room and a table in there and a box of tools and 2 ropes hanging from the ceiling. And what they asked people to do, for $1, grab a rope. But for $2, hold both ropes. Well, back then, $1 was a lot of money, over 100 years ago. People would hold one rope, couldn't reach the other one. Wait a minute, what if I hold the first rope? No, I can't reach the other one. People would look around the room and be like, okay, there's a table, there's tools in a box. It can't be done. Give me my $1. Well, if you took 2 tools out of the box and maybe tied a hammer on one rope and tied a wrench on the other one, swing them back and forth, and wait for the ropes to swing back to you, you could be holding both ropes. Why don't people think of that? That's not usually how you use a hammer or a wrench. You have to get past the functional fixedness. And there's a slide on the PowerPoint showing you exactly that, showing you how it would look in action. Then they talk about algorithms and heuristics. Same thing that we just talked about. You don't need to go into any more detail. The next PowerPoint slide tells you that creative thinking helps you get past barriers and functional fixedness and brainstorming, coming up with ideas. All of these things are important, but you don't really need to know that for the test. Just know what we've talked about so far, including functional fixedness. Moving right along, next topic is intelligence. Intelligence is rather controversial. How exactly do we measure how smart or intelligent a person is? Well, let's go through it here. It all started in 1904 in France. Alfred Binet was the Minister of Education for the whole country, kind of like our U.S. Secretary of Education, similar kind of role. Alfred Binet came up with a test that measures your mental age, and he compared that to your chronological or real age. So let me tell you how this worked. Let's say we have a group of 10-year-olds, and the first kid is super smart. He tests like a 12-year-old mentally on Binet's test, but he's really 10. 12 divided by 10 is 1.2. You always multiply the score you get times 100, and that gives you the IQ score, 120. Now let's say another 10-year-old is a little slower mentally and intellectually. He mentally is like a 7-year-old, but he's 10. So what is the decimal? 0.7 times 100. That kid has an IQ of 70. Now what about a kid who's just as average as can be? She is 10, and mentally she tests like a 10-year-old. Well, that would be 1.0 times 100. The IQ is 100. So the lesson here is, no matter how old you are, the average IQ is 100. If you're 23 years old right now, we're only going to compare you to other 23-year-olds, says Binet in his test. And therefore, if you're exactly average, your IQ would still be 100. Reliability and validity. It's important for an IQ test to be reliable. Kind of like a person being reliable, you can count on him or count on her. Well, if a test is reliable, you can count on it to give you accurate and the same results. I shouldn't have said accurate because that's confusing with validity. Consistent results is a more accurate way to say it. So, validity. If something is valid, it's measuring what it is supposed to be measuring. So what are we measuring here? Intelligence. That's the controversial part, because maybe we're not measuring intelligence like we think we are. That could be a problem. What if a person is from another culture, speaks another language, is sick on the day of testing, is just having a bad day or a bad attitude? It's hard to know if we're really measuring a person's intelligence. So validity is a bigger problem than reliability on these tests. People do tend to score the same year after year, taking the test over again. Not exactly the same, but similar. The problem is validity. Are we really measuring what we thought we measured? So here is an example. A person from another culture. You're Native American and you live on a reservation in Arizona. You might not have the same experiences as others who live in big cities. And if an IQ question asks about the role of police officers or the mayor or the governor, maybe you don't have that knowledge. Maybe somebody is from another country and their experience is different. One of the old IQ tests, one of the questions was, who is Neil Armstrong? That's easy. First man on the moon. Well, what if you're from a culture that doesn't celebrate and value that moment in history? You might not know those things. So getting an IQ test that is valid, or what we call culture fair and language fair, is challenging. Validity is the bigger problem. The next couple of slides in the PowerPoint tell you all about this, and we'll get to this in a minute. Validity, we'll get back to it, I should say. First of all, however, in statistics, there's concepts called mean and standard deviation. If you take a statistics class, you'll learn this. First of all, mean, the average. We went over that already. The average IQ is 100. No matter how old you are, you're only being compared to people your own age. But standard deviation, that's a little different. In IQ testing, every 15 points puts you in a new category. So if you're over 115, you're above average. Over 130, you're gifted. On the bottom end of this normal curve, if you can picture it, if not, check your book and check the PowerPoints too. You'll see a normal curve. 85, below that, you're considered below average in your intelligence. And below 70, intellectual disability. Now, that used to be called mental retardation. But as you probably know, retarded has become a bad word. So the terminology has changed. It's now an intellectual disability. However, just having a low IQ score is not enough to be considered intellectually disabled. You also have to lack adaptive functioning. If you're in high school and you still don't know how to get home on your own, that's a problem. If you're in first grade and you still don't know your letters and numbers, that's a problem. If you don't have the judgment to know what to do when your college class is canceled for the day, that's a problem. Adaptive skills. Can you do the things that people your age should be able to do? So when you have a lack of adaptive functioning combined with a very low IQ below 70, we call that intellectual disability. And think of a normal curve. The further you get away on either end from the middle, the more rare it becomes, the more unusual. So an IQ of 50 is just as rare as an IQ of 150. It's that simple to understand because it falls on a normal curve. Another thing I want you to know, research on IQ testing says that women tend to perform better on measures of IQ, what we call subtests, that are verbal in nature. Vocabulary, comprehension, using words and sentences, females tend to do better. Understanding, all of that stuff. But men tend to do better, and boys, on performance measures. Puzzles, mazes, graphs, Block design, I'm going to show you in a minute. And by the way, those are less culturally biased than your vocabulary and your comprehension and your knowledge. Just so you know. But females tend to do better on that verbal stuff. So let me show you one of the performance measures. Again, we do see males doing slightly better on these on average, but not always. See these blocks? Some sides are all red, some sides are completely white, or half and half. What if I showed you pictures and as quickly as you can, you had to put the blocks together in the shape of the picture? That is only one aspect of intelligence, but it is called a performance measure as opposed to verbal. So again, females tend to do better on the verbal stuff, whereas males tend to do slightly better on the performance stuff. Last thing on this PowerPoint slide, this is going to sound a little sexist or gender biased, but research says there's some truth to it. The very high end of IQ scores, we tend to see slightly more males than females. IQs above 130. What? That's not fair. Well, here's the revenge. On the very low end, more males than females also. Isn't that interesting? Males tend to run the gamut of the normal curve slightly more than females do. The same is true for physical abilities. When you meet someone who is in a wheelchair or a walker or physically disabled, more males than females. But on the other end, you meet someone who could bench press 300 pounds or run a 5-minute mile, more males than females. Men and boys, males, tend to run the curve from the middle all the way to the extremes more than females do on a lot of things. Now, the next PowerPoint slide talks about different ways of measuring intelligence, and don't go into any more detail for the exam than we've already talked about. It's just a little more information. Picture of a normal curve comes up. That's just a good visual. Show you what percentage of people fit into each category. That part won't be on the test, but just know what a normal curve is. Gifted. You have an IQ of over 130. There is a club for you if you can pass their test called Mensa. M-E-N-S-A. Now, if you speak any Spanish or Italian or Latin, I don't know if anybody speaks Latin anymore, but anyway, it means dummy, stupid, not intelligent. Well, isn't that ironic? That's the name of the club. It is an acronym for something, and it's not meant to be dummy. They probably did that on purpose because those smart people think of everything, huh? But it's a club for smart people, and the slang in other languages means dumb or dummy. Intellectual disability, IQ below 70, and lack of adaptive functioning. Now, like we talked about, there is a validity problem in IQ testing, especially with the verbal components. To prove that, 2 African-American psychologists and professors in the early 70s, they made their own IQ test as a joke. It was sarcasm. They called it the bitch. B-I-T-C-H. Black Intelligence Test of Culture and Heritage. They did not mean for this to be serious. They were trying to prove a point. Stuff that mostly black folks would know back then. If you were white, if you were Asian, Native American, you would be less likely to understand and be able to display your knowledge. Did they really think that everybody in the US should take the bitch, starting in kindergarten and moving on? Of course not. They were trying to prove the point that maybe the test that we use can be culturally biased and language biased for that matter too. Next thing, genetics and environment make up your IQ. It is related to what you've inherited in your brain, but also things that happen to you in your life, especially your early childhood. Next PowerPoint slide, Robert Sternberg talks about there being 3 kinds of intelligence. Don't forget his name. He comes up again later in this semester. Different chapter though. Analytic intelligence, that's what IQ tests measure, your knowledge and your abilities. But Sternberg argues, what about creative intelligence? If you're super creative, maybe you're good with art or music, isn't that intelligence? And what about practical intelligence? You can figure your way out of any situation, nothing stumps you, you're going to be on top and figure it out. Practical. Maybe working with your hands, or just that you can figure out how to accomplish anything. There are different kinds of intelligence. Last topic in this chapter, language. Language is spoken or written, but we're going to talk about spoken language, and we're going to talk about how that works in the brain, how the brain processes it into thinking and expression of language. So first of all, infinite generativity. What do they mean? There are endless possibilities of how many words you can combine into sentences and phrases and paragraphs. So, if you know a whole bunch of words, thousands of them, there are almost an infinity of possibilities of what you can say and express. Kind of like I'm doing now, huh? Moving right along. Language, spoken language that is, starts with phonemes. Phone is sound. That's what the word means. Your phone hopefully does more than just sound if it's working correctly, but that's what phone means. In English, we use 45 sounds. Now you might be thinking, what? We have 26 letters. Not only that, C and K, they kind of make the same sound. Well, if you really think about it, in English, we use more sounds than that. There is the TH, that's a unique sound, double O, SH, the long A, like in rake, the short A, like in bat. We have 45 sounds. That's what you need to know. Sounds make up words. I guess a sound could be a word, like A or I. Usually it takes multiple sounds, multiple phonemes to make a word. Words make sentences. But here's where it gets a little complicated. There is syntax and there is semantics. Syntax is whether you get the words in the right order to express yourself. Different languages do this differently. In English, we say we say White House. I got that backwards. White House. Whereas in Spanish, Casablanca. Do you see how it's backwards? We might say in English, Moon Valley, whereas the name of the restaurant and the area of Phoenix is called Moon Valley, but in Spanish, Valle Luna. And that's a restaurant too, by the way. So therefore, it's backwards to what we're used to. In Asian languages, you might say dog, black, two, big. And in English, we would say two big black dogs. The plural is different. We use that in English, and some languages, it's just a modifier, and the structure of it as well. That's syntax. Semantics is the meaning. If it's not complicated enough to learn the syntax, the order that things go in a new language, semantics is even more confusing. The meaning. I had a friend in graduate school who grew up speaking Mandarin Chinese. Terms in English confused him, like apartment complex. He thought it was complex to find your apartment. That's not exactly what it means, is it? I remember when one of my kids was little and we drove by an old folks home that said quality living for seniors, and there was a misunderstanding of whether that meant seniors in high school. When you're learning a language for the first time or a new language as a second language, it can be confusing. The meaning of what's being said, not just the structure of the sentences. So, moving right along. One more thing, this is on the next PowerPoint slide. Linguistic relativity hypothesis is actually on 2 slides in a row. The language you learn growing up has a lot to do with the way that you think about, well, pretty much everything. So, if you grew up in an Eskimo community, there might be 26 different ways of describing snow. But those of us who grew up here speaking English in the Phoenix area, that's pretty much it. We say it's snowing or it's not snowing. Other cultures don't have a word for, say, homosexuality or depression or anxiety. Well, guess what? If there's no word for it, then it's probably not discussed or even thought about. That's what the linguistic relativity hypothesis says. By the way, I had a student one semester who told me that she grew up speaking a tribal dialect in a Native American community in northern Arizona, and she said, "We have no phrase for I'm sorry." Well, guess what? I guess nobody apologizes, do they? It's just not part of the language. Moving right along. How do we develop language? It's a pretty predictable pattern. Newborn babies cry, and that is a form of communication. Different cries mean different things if you know your baby well enough. Then the baby starts cooing. Sounds, ooh, ah, those have meaning to the baby. Babbling, 6 to 12 months of age, random syllables, the baby thinks that he or she's communicating. Those of us grown-ups think it's funny and cute. We don't know what they're saying. Right around the age of 1 year old, which is 12 months, babies will say their first word. A lot of people think it's mama or dada. It could be, but it really is anything the baby sees moving. The baby will point to it and say what they see moving. Car, ball, maybe mama, dada, maybe dog or kitty. The baby will notice something moving, point to it, and say it out loud. Next thing, 2 words. It's not until you're about 2 years old that you start putting words together. And that kind of speech is known as telegraphic speech. Nobody uses telegraphs anymore. That's old school. We now email and text and everything else. Social media, but way back in the day, you paid by the word to send a telegraph across the country or across the world. So therefore, if you were to say, "Our baby was born today. His name is Jack. Everybody's fine. We're all happy and healthy." That's a lot of words. You might just say, "Baby born today. Name Jack. Everyone well." That's not a real paragraph, but it saves money, and babies talk like that when they're, well, I guess I should say toddlers, when they're only about 2. They put words together that don't always make a whole lot of sense, but they still convey their message as well as they can at that age. After you're 2, you start putting together sentences, and it makes more sense. Then people can understand what you're saying, and eventually that progresses into adult-like communication. So that's all you need to know for this chapter. The exam, I should say exam number 2, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Take care.